So we could compare now the differences between case method and lecturing and begin to get a sense of the pros and cons. Lecturing in some sense is faster in the sense that you can talk through the concepts that you want to cover and get to the end of those by the end of the class period. On the other hand, is it faster in terms of how much students have learned? You have more control. You can have some sense of assurance at the end of the class that you've covered your material. You can ensure that you've given them, shall I say in quotes, the correct answer, that is the answer that you believe to be the right one. It gives you the chance to be on stage and to be the focal point of attention. It tends to be more theory-based rather than practical-based, and it may lead, in my view, to more superficial learning. Learning at level 2, cognitive thought, where people may be able to talk about concepts at a reception or a cocktail party, but they may or may not be able to actually implement or make decisions related to those concepts. And lecturing tends to be unilateral. That means it's one way from the instructor to the students, and you really don't get a lot of feedback. You may be able to read some body language and facial gestures from a large audience, or however big the audience is. But you really don't understand what's going on inside of them at level 2 and level 3 because they haven't been given a chance to express that. So case method, on the other hand, tends to be slower, more messy. There's going to be detours. People will go down some blind alleys. This is a part of the discovery process, so that you may or may not be able to cover as much material in the same amount of time. That has not been my experience, I will say. Nevertheless, a lot of people don't like case method because it seems to be, to them, less efficient. It gives you less control. If students are talking, they may go in a direction that you don't want to go. So there's a set of skills that's required to facilitate that discussion in a way that students don't feel like you're hypercritical or hyper-judgmental and shutting off discussion that they think is important, in which case then they're going to shut down. Their willingness to be open to what you have to offer will decline. You will also find days when you didn't get everything done. So again, we come back to your philosophy of learning. Is your goal as an instructor to quote-unquote mention everything in your syllabus to cover the material, or is it to ensure some level of depth of learning and understanding and ability to apply in the hearts and minds of your students? There may or may not be a right answer in case method. So if you, for example, are trying to calculate the hurdle rate for an investment organization, if you're trying to calculate how long it's going to take to deliver a new product to the customer, if you're trying to calculate what you should value another firm at, or how long it would take to change a bottleneck in a process that seems to be holding up everyone else, there may or may not be close to accurate answers. You may be able to calculate using a particular paradigm a correct answer, but then what do you do with it? How do you get others to agree with your analysis and to persuade them that that's what they should do? Their assumptions may not align. So this issue of a right answer, I think for me, has pros and cons to it. Sometimes we can calculate mathematically what the correct answer is, and then the issue is, well, what do you do with that, and how do you make it implemented or executed in your organization? Case method requires more preparation. There's no doubt about that. In a lecture class, people can slip in, slip out, maybe woke up 5 minutes before class and didn't read the chapter. In a case method classroom where you're involving students actively, that's not likely to be a winning formula. It can be a formula for embarrassment. It can be a formula for intimidation, some would say. There's a certain edge that comes from knowing if I'm not prepared for class for whatever reason, then I'm at some risk in the eyes of the facilitator and some risk in the eyes of my peers. So this places a higher responsibility for learning on the students. In case method, learning becomes a joint responsibility with the instructor and the students. In lecture, even though I'm not sure we talk about it that much, most of the responsibility seems to be placed on the instructor to edutain, entertain, and educate the people in the room, and most are not very good at that, and so lectures tend to be more boring, and students come away with a feeling of lower responsibility for their own learning and insight. Case method can be intimidating, as I've hinted. If you don't know if your number is going to come up, whether it's a random number process that the facilitator uses, or they simply call on you randomly, or because you haven't said anything for a while and they want to hear what you have to say, some people find that intimidating. We're very explicit about advertising and making known in advance, whether it's the MBA degree programs or the non-degreed short executive education programs for older folks, that this is what it's going to be like. We're going to be actively engaged with each other. We're going to be discussing and presenting our points of view with each other. And this is, we believe, in what we declare as our mission to develop principled leaders. This is an essential skill in leadership, to be able to think on your feet, to collect your ideas, to present them in a cogent, coherent, and persuasive way. And we're going to practice that regardless of what the particular subject matter is for that particular class. So this is behavioral practice. Some people who criticize case method will say that it's really instructor focused, and again that comes back for me to which of the dialects of case method are you using. My belief is, and the principle that I employ is, that you're going to be able to practice in every class if you get involved, and if you don't raise your hand, you might get called on. You're going to have an opportunity to practice the essential leadership communication skill set. Again, thinking on your feet, collecting your ideas, translating from a thought into words, demonstrating your commitment to those words with your facial, your voice, your tone, your speed, your hand gestures. All of that will be a part of your ability to practice every day. It's like leadership taekwondo. You can't learn taekwondo without training, and I don't believe you can learn to be persuasive likewise without training. And then finally, it's a bilateral process. So we're going to be going back and forth. There are patterns to how we go back and forth. We don't necessarily want to have just instructors talking with students. We want to have students talking with students around the room. So here's where some of the other fundamental issues, like setting, the kind of room you have, whether it's tiered or not, whether the chairs and tables are movable or not, whether they're round so that half of the people in the room have their backs to you or not. All of those issues will either enhance or hinder the development of an effective case method classroom discussion. Now, let's spend a minute and talk about the dialects in case method. We can think of that in terms of, on the vertical axis over here, the percent of talk between the instructor and the students. And by drawing this diagonal line, we can think about, well, at the lecture methodology, virtually all of the talk is done by the instructor. If we move to a case method, well, there's a greater proportion of sharing between what the instructor says and how much of what is said by the students. And I suppose if the instructor is not there when they have learning teams, then it's all student talk. Now, I'm aware of at least one professor at the Harvard Business School who would walk in, sit down, and never say a word in a 90-minute class. He would sit there until silence became uncomfortable. Somebody would make a comment about the case, someone else would raise their hand, and then they would comment, and the whole 90 minutes was completely student talk. That would be what I would call, I guess, classic case method instruction. It's not one that I'm comfortable using all the time. Occasionally I will do that just to see what they get without any guidance, support, nudging, encouragement, or questions. So another criticism of case method could be that students learn unintentionally to rely on the facilitator for the formulation of the right questions. And finding the right question is an important case method skill, no doubt. The downside of that, though, is that by the second year, if you were to walk into a classroom, as I have frequently done, and ask the students, what should we do today? They're a little bit flummoxed because they've been taught, not intentionally, but nevertheless, inexorably, they've been taught the guy in the front of the room is going to ask the questions. So they will set the agenda and they will guide us into what we're going to talk about. I think that's a mistake. So particularly in my second year classes, near the end of my first year classes, I really want the students to take a more active role in thinking about, well, okay, now we see this situation, what are the key issues, what are the important questions, can we formulate those? Because a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when I'm out in the business world, there's not going to be anyone there to say, here's what the agenda for the meeting should look like. Here are the 3 segments we're going to parse this hour and a half together into. Someone else is going to have to do that. So getting the students to be more actively involved can be a challenge, and in some ways, depending on how much this ratio is in your particular dialect of use of case method, over here you could assign a case and then lecture the analysis of it. Over here you could use a case that throughout a whole term you just use one case and you're guiding the students. Over in here you might just be asking the right questions and relying on student response and the quality of your questions to fulfill this balance and your goal of having discovery-centered learning.